Hello and welcome to the video. In this video I'm going to convert this WL Toys car, if I can even say it, into an ExpressLRS receiver, specifically the fantastic MT12. Now I've done loads of videos on this already. It is an ExpressLRS version that I have here. It is running HTX, which is a very powerful system, but can appear a little complicated at first. So that's exactly why I'm making the video, because this potentially, with all its extra switches and gizmos and gadgets, can allow me to do some extra stuff with this particular model. For example, I want to change it in the future so that I can control the lights to come on and off with a switch on the radio, and that's relatively easy to do, and I'll do that in a follow-up video. And potentially then add things like FPV to it and even things like pan and tilt. But all that stuff relies on me having a radio that I can change the settings on. So this is really step one. There are a number of things that you have to do in order to get to the end. Don't worry, I'm going to show you every single step. If you are unfamiliar with this, by hopefully following along, you'll get to the end and be able to convert your existing models. And this is particularly handy if you are like a friend of mine who used to get a radio with every single model that he bought. So he ended up with about 6 of these things in a line in his garage, and he had shares in Duracell for the number of batteries he was going through. This would allow you to pull the receivers out of the cars and just have that one radio and just have a model set up for each of those individual cars, trucks, boats, whatever it is. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that the car or truck has to have a separate physical receiver that you can pull out in order to replace it with a new one that will work with your new radio. Now, with some of the new radios in the MT12, you can get multi-protocol ones that you can actually get to bind to older receivers, but I would recommend, if you're going to do this, I would bite the bullet and go for ExpressLRS. ExpressLRS is the modern radio system, really developed initially for multi-rotors, but has come on fantastically since then. And I'm going to install something called an ER5C. This is a 5-channel receiver to replace the one that's already inside this. The reason I'm going for 5 channels is that I'm obviously going to need steering, I'm going to need throttle, but also I want an extra channel to be able to turn my lights on and off. And then I might want another couple of channels for things like pan and tilt for some kind of FPV head tracking as well. So that's what I am going to install. The only other trick I'll give you is that when you have taken out the receiver that's already inside this, then I would just plug in the steering servo into a servo checker, and just with a servo checker confirm what the middle channel, i.e. the wheels are straight, looks like. Look at that value on the servo checker. It isn't absolutely necessary, we can fix that later on, but if you know that, it makes the setup on the radio an awful lot easier. So with all that said, let's go and actually set up the model that we're going to need for this particular car on that MT12, and then we can bind the receiver, install it, and make sure it works. So let's turn the radio on and go through that setup. It isn't too tricky, but there's a couple of little tricks, particularly when we're talking about ExpressLRS. There's a couple of little wrinkles on here that we need to take care of. So first of all, we'll go into the model menu. We'll select an empty spot and hit enter and say create model. Now, if you're watching this well after spring 2024, this may be a little bit more elaborate. At the moment, it just creates a very basic model. If we go into the next page here, we can see all the different settings for how it's all set up. We only have 2 inputs, throttle and steering, and that is all we have. Now, in the inputs, I would add a little bit of expo into the steering. So we'll highlight steering, press and hold the enter key and say edit. We'll go down until we get to the expo bit. We'll hit enter, and I would add probably a nice healthy chunk, probably about 35%. We'll see how that feels. That will just deaden the controls around middle stick, so it means that there's finer control. That's the first thing we need to do. I would also potentially, if we exit out of this, I would also go back. Let's actually give it a name. It's always a good idea, isn't it? Let's call it something like WL Toys. And don't forget, by pressing and holding the enter key, that's going to give us lowercase. Next thing I want to do is add a throttle cut so that we have a safe position where the throttle will not work. So I'm going to go into something called special functions, hit the enter key. I'm going to move the switch. I'm going to use this one down here below into its default position as the radio starts. And I'm going to say that we're going to override the throttle channel to 0, which is the middle channel position. Make sure that is turned on. And we can check that's the case if we come all the way out. If I now pull the trigger, nothing happens. If I now move that switch out of position, just be aware, be careful of this. The little thing at the top is actually showing you all the different channels that are available, and I had it, you can see there's like a little solid bar. In a car we just want channels 1 and 2. It isn't moving until I flick the switch, and then it is. That's kind of a throttle safety. There's another little thing that we need to do with that same switch. We need to tell the ExpressLRS system that we're going to use in this car that it is active, so all of the goodness turns on. It's not in kind of standby mode. At the moment with ExpressLRS we have to do that by changing channel 5 to a high value. It's a bit of a weird legacy thing, but we need to do it. So let's go back into the menu, zoom across until we get to the special functions again, and this time we're going to do enter, and we're going to move the switch into the position. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, rather than say SA in the up position, we're going to scroll with it highlighted, and we're going to find when it has an exclamation SA in the up position, and we're going to say turn channel 5 to 100% and turn that on as well. So now that means that when the throttle cut is off, the ExpressLRS system is going to be kind of at full power, if you want to think of it like that. Again, we can see that in action, because when the throttle cut is in the default position, my throttle isn't working, I get no movement at all. When it moves out the position, not only do I get my throttle working, but channel 5 over here has gone to full power, so we need to do that too. Next thing we do then is we need to bind to the receiver. Now, to bind to the receiver, there's a couple of different ways that ExpressLRS does this. By default, these receivers come without something called a bind phrase on it. So the two ways that you can bind to a receiver is either you can power it 3 times very quickly to put it into bind mode, and in here what we'll do is we'll click on System, we'll go into the ExpressLRS menu, and if it ever does this, it means we haven't told the radio we want to use ExpressLRS. So let's come out of that. We'll go across and we'll go right down to the bottom of this second screen, or it actually rolls around, and we will say the internal mode is going to be for CRSF, which is the way that the radio communicates with the ExpressLRS goodness inside. So now, when with that set on, if we go into System again, hit ExpressLRS, we should get all of that stuff appearing. So there we go. Now down here we have the ability to hit the bind, and then that will bind to the receiver. Now you can either set up a passphrase on the radio and the receiver, so they just kind of bind automatically. Like I said, the receivers by default will come without a bind phrase on them. So to get them to bind, you need to power them very quickly 3 times. So I'm just going to use a battery eliminator circuit here, which is going to give it the 5 volts. However, you could just plug it into, you know, a 5 volt power supply. So let me do it very quickly. 1, 2, 3. That's not quite got it. The button only flashing once. Let's try again. 1, 2, 3. I'll do it 4. There we go. Now the LED is double flashing. It's in bind mode. I will hit bind on the radio, and the LED has gone solid. We are in great shape. If we come out of that all the way, we now see that we've got these little signal indicators on the screen. So that is now bound. Now, the only other thing I would check is I would leave this receiver powered for 60 seconds. It'll create something called a Wi-Fi access point. You can connect to it via a browser on your computer. You'll find it appears as ExpressLRS RX. You can connect to it, go into the model menu, and just make sure that the fail-safe values for the PWM channels are all exactly how you want them. Now, obviously, we are going to want the throttle to be 0, and the steering to be 0 as well. And that isn't always the way they're set up, so I would just do that. Now we have that, we are now ready to go and install
telemetry last.
We're also getting telemetry back, so we will be wiring it up to the battery voltage inside the car so that we can have that displayed on the radio. But we can now go back to the car, install this, and do the final bits of setup. So back inside the car, here is the receiver that we've set up. Now we need to plug in the pieces into the receiver, and each of the channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. are shown here on the receiver itself, and we need to make sure that we're getting everything the right way round. Obviously we only have 2 connections here. We have one that's coming from the steering servo, and we have this other one here that's connected to the ESC, so it's easy to see which is going to be the throttle and which is going to be steering. So on this particular receiver, channel 1 just happens to be throttle in this particular example. I'm sure in the future that's potentially going to change, so double check to make sure yours is the right way round. So I'm going to plug the ESC into channel 1, again making sure that the polarity is right. So typically the opposite side of notches is going to be the negative. I'm also going to plug in steering into channel 2, and then we can actually pop this into position. Now I'm going to put it where the other receiver was, which is kind of here-ish. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it in place with a bit of double-sided foam tape. I'm going to wrap a cable tie around it. Now we've only got one more thing that we can do here before we power everything up. Now this little receiver, this connection on the top here, is actually for voltage sensing. So we can connect that via the cable that comes as part of the kit to the positive terminal here on the ESC, and that's going to tell us or send telemetry back to the radio or what the voltage on the car is as it's running around. Now this cable comes as part of the kit, so it needs to plug it into the top, and I need to do a little bit of soldering and just solder it onto the positive terminal here on the ESC. And then once that's done, then let's just come back in a moment. We'll check everything still looks okay, power it up, and just test it all for the first time. So here we have the car with it all installed. So we have the receiver now in the middle with a cable tie over the top, and we have the little red cable going from the voltage sense, and it's actually soldered to the bottom of that pin. Now it's here on the bench. I have it plugged into a battery, but it's not live. I'm using something here called a smoke stopper. It's just a handy thing to make sure if there's any issues with the wiring, that rather than the magic smoke come out and it never work again, we should be okay. Now I would probably recommend that you have this slightly off the ground as well in case everything bursts into life. So let me grab a couple of boxes and stick the model on those boxes so that if we are unlucky enough that something horrible happens, the actual tyres are not on the bench. So let's turn on our radio. And we're going to need to check here that all the directions and everything are right in terms of the steering and also the throttle too. So I'm just going to turn on the switch on the bottom of the car first. I think that's the right way. Let's power it up. Okay, turn on the switch. It's immediately cut out with the smoke stopper. So what I'll do is I'll actually connect it directly to the battery. I'm reasonably confident that this is okay. So let's just bite the bullet. Let's power it up. So there we go. We have the receiver connected. Let's check the steering works. It does. And it's in the right direction. If it wasn't, then what we could do is reverse it. And we'll do that at the very end. We've tested everything. Last thing to do, I'm going to actually hold it for this bit, which is slightly dangerous, but it's kind of the way we're going to have to do this. I'm going to pull the trigger. I'm obviously going to take it out of throttle hold, so it's now active. Let me pull the trigger. That's going in the right direction. In reverse, that's going in the right direction as well. Okay, that looks really promising. So let me unplug the battery just so everything's safe. And then what we can do is we can do the last bits of setup on the radio just to get everything absolutely spot on. Now we know that the basic controls work, we're in a really good place. However, it may be that when you come to try it, you find that your steering is backwards, or maybe your ESC is backwards. Probably more likely to be your steering, and also the midpoint that we had a look at with the servo checker is also slightly out. Now, we can obviously use the trims on the radio to kind of sort the steering out when we actually get to run the car, but we can use the radio to get it very close before we start. So what we're going to do, we're going to the model menu, and let's go across into a screen that we haven't looked at before, which is called outputs. This is where we set all of the output characteristics for the individual channels that we're talking about. At the moment on this radio, if you remember, channel 1 is the throttle, channel 2 is the steering. So say, for example, our steering was backwards, that's easy to fix. We highlight channel 2 and we say edit, and what we do is we go down and we find where it says direction to be inverted, and that will then reverse the steering channel. This is where I do it. Mine works okay, so I'm going to put it back to normal. The other thing you might note at the top, there's this little thing here that tells me exactly what the output from the receiver is going to be, i.e. 1500. That's middle channel position. However, if you needed 1460, you knew that from the playing on the bench, that's where you needed 4 straight steering, then we can go into the sub trim and we can highlight the sub trim and we can change that value, and you can see here it's changing it at the top, and we can go down and get it so that it says 1460, and that means that by default it's going to be pretty close when we go. However, mine was actually pretty good. The tracking and everything looked reasonable, so I'm going to set mine back to where it was, which is the default of 1500. Don't forget, I would recommend, if it's vastly away from 1500, personally I would have a look at maybe resetting the linkages on the servo, and once you've done all that, whatever number is here on the radio, I would go back onto the receiver via the Wi-Fi page and set that default, that same number as the default for the steering channel, and that means if it was ever running and something happened to the radio, the wheels would just go straight, so it would kind of roll to a stop in a straight line rather than be turning and flipping over potentially and damaging itself. Only last couple of things here. The other thing as well, if I just come out here, is if we go all the way out to what's called telemetry. At the moment the car isn't powered up, but if I go down here with the car powered up, and I'll insert an image here of what this looks like and say discover new, what it's going to do is it's going to find this value here. That is the value of the battery inside the model, and that now means that I can use that as telemetry. So I could set up a warning on this thing so that when it drops below a certain value, the radio is going to let me know that that's the case, or I could even get it displayed on things like a telemetry screen here on the radio as well. So there we go. That's how I would set up a car like this. Isn't particularly tricky. Hopefully by following all of those steps, you'll get to the end and you'll have as much fun. Do stay tuned. I'm going to be talking about using curves and some other bits to do things like increase the ability to have very sensitive steering at slow speed and other things too, as well as some other tips and tricks. Thank you for watching the video. If you watch my videos and find them useful, then please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel a lot. If you really like what I'm doing here, you can become a Patreon and support the time I spend helping others and get access to lots of exclusive benefits. Link is in the video description. Remember that all the videos on the channel are organised into playlists, so you can easily use those playlists to find all the videos on a subject that you are interested in. Add Painless 360 to your searches on Google and YouTube, and it'll help you find my content for any particular topic. Thanks again for watching, and as always, happy flying.